welcome, welcome. I hope you're safe and well and sheltering in place. It's awesome to see so many friends, people that I know and also people that I don't know here today. Really excited to have this very first episode of Leading with Empathy and Allyship. So I'm Melinda Briana Epler, the founder and CEO of Change Catalyst. Change Catalyst builds inclusive innovation ecosystems through training, consulting, and events globally. We are extremely lucky to have Anthony Diaz, an ASL interpreter today, sponsored by Interpreter Now. Thank you so much, Anthony. This series is focused on leading with empathy and allyship, and I wanted to just really quickly define allyship. There's no magic wand for correcting diversity and inclusion and equity. It's you and me working together, creating change one person at a time, one act at a time, one word at a time. And we do that by being allies, by recognizing that there's an imbalance in opportunity and that some people regularly face biases, discrimination, microaggressions, and then acknowledging that and working to correct it, to support each other and to advocate for each other. And a big piece of allyship is listening and learning. So that's what this is all about. Today, I'm really excited to have Michelle Kim joining us. She's the co-founder and CEO of Awaken. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super humbled and excited to be here, and congrats on this launch.
Thank you. Thank you. So this week, we're going to be talking about xenophobia, and specifically anti-Asian xenophobia and racism that's coming up as a result of COVID-19. We'll define it more in a bit, but first, just wanted to talk about Michelle. So Michelle, can you just tell us briefly your story, what your story is? How did you end up doing what you're doing, and what do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so thrilled to be here, and also just want to say hi to all the folks who are in the audience. I like to say that diversity, equity, and inclusion work is all about lived experiences and our human experiences. So I don't often call myself a DEI expert because I can only be an expert in my own lived experience and stories. And I just want to acknowledge that so many people who are dialed in right now are also experts in their own lived experiences. So when it comes to my own story, it really starts with my experience as an Asian woman immigrant, as a queer person, as someone who navigated both the social justice space as well as the corporate space, as well as the tech space. That really culmination of all those experiences led me to what I'm doing right now, which is running a company called Awaken. What we do is provide experiential, interactive, diversity, equity, inclusion related workshops that go beyond just checking the box. And I was, with so many people probably can resonate with this story, which is that in my experience in the corporate space and also tech space, I felt so much of the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion felt surface level, diluted, and frankly, whitewashed. And I wanted to create space where we can have both compassion and criticality to bring a little bit more of the essence, which is rooted in social justice work, to be able to make that content accessible to so many people while having a little bit more challenging conversations that can push the envelope on those conversations. So that's what I do, and that's why I'm here, and I'm excited to share some of my stories.
Awesome, awesome. So I said a little bit about allyship, but how do you define allyship? I think it's different for everyone. So what is your definition of allyship?
Yeah, so I have our Awaken definition of allyship, which is really grounded in understanding and acknowledging the differences in power and privilege that exist in our society, as well as the goal of allyship actually being about achieving equity and inclusion. And I think a huge part of allyship also is about holding ourselves accountable to the needs of the marginalized people. And I think so often today, what we see in the world is performative allyship is what I call it, and how people want to sort of signal their virtues externally. And I see a lot of tech companies or companies of all sizes do that these days, right? DEI is a very trendy topic, and people are too quick to market their desire to be allies before they're actually committed to working towards, working in solidarity with marginalized communities. So I think a huge definition of allyship needs to be accountability and what that looks like and how we're doing the work within ourselves even before we are out there intervening on biases, because I think that's often what people think of when they hear the word being an ally, is you are out there sort of advocating for other people or advocating on behalf of folks, rather than really checking your own privilege and your power and showing up in ways that's really amplifying and also creating space for marginalized people to do their work on their own and being able to recognize that they have the agency and power to do so.
Awesome, awesome. I think that's a really important piece of that is the holding ourselves accountable. It's, you know, there's nobody else is holding us accountable for this. A really great ally is the one that's holding yourself accountable for learning, for growing, for stepping in, for doing something. Awesome. So let's talk about xenophobia and also talk a little, you know, define that. You know, it happens daily. It's not just now. It happens daily, and it has happened for hundreds of years. And we also see a large increase often during major points of history where fear is a driving force, where fear is really grabbing a hold of us. And we saw a rise in xenophobia, anti-Muslim xenophobia around 9/11, as well as many times throughout history. And you know, right now, if several of my Asian and Asian American friends are really struggling because of harassment and being bullied, just walking down the street, walking on the sidewalk, going into grocery stores and online, and are afraid to go out, afraid to wear masks because that might trigger somebody and harassment, and they're afraid for the safety of their friends and their family members. So, and that's all on top of the stresses that we all face around this pandemic. So can you help us define xenophobia and what's happening now?
Yeah, of course. So I did a little search on the etymology of the word xenophobia, and it literally means in Greek, stranger fearing. So xeno meaning stranger or strange or guest, and phobia and phobe meaning fear. So xenophobia literally means that you are afraid of and you're fearful of people or someone who looks different or who is deemed to be a foreigner. And I think it's such an interesting word for us to be using right now about specifically Asian people in America, because, you know, throughout history, Asian Americans and Asian folks have been seen as perpetual foreigners. I don't know if folks have been, you know, hearing that phrase throughout history, but, you know, no matter the rich histories of Asians in the US contributing to the society and to the country and our history overall, we're rarely seen as actual Americans, right? We're rarely seen as people who belong in this country. And we see historical sort of legacies and policies that have clearly discerned and defined who is American versus not, who belongs, who doesn't belong. And I think the term xenophobia really accentuates the fact that we are seen as foreign, and we are always going to be sort of this perpetual foreigner in this country, despite the history that we bring to this nation.
And how are you seeing this coming up in the workplace? So, I mean, and we all bring ourselves into the workplace and all that is happening in our lives to the workplace. So this is not, you know, one or the other, it's all of the above, that people are experiencing this outside of the workplace, and that affects how we're, you know, the energy that we have to do our work. And so can you talk a little bit about what's happening in the workplace?
Of course. And, you know, I think it's, especially now when we're doing work in our own homes, for those of us who are lucky enough to have, you know, be able to shelter in place, I think that boundary is getting more and more blurred, right? What is considered at work versus what is not. And I think that blurring of boundaries have been happening for some time now, where people are, you know, really advocating for the ability to be able to be who they are or show up as their best selves at work. I don't know if I believe necessarily in bringing your whole self to work. It's a whole nother conversation. I think there are boundaries that we can set, and being able to give that agency to people, I think, is important. And I think right now the blur boundaries is becoming more clear than ever around how our current identities, our social identities, or our living situations, or socioeconomic status, how all of these things can influence the way that we are able to cope with the current situation. And this xenophobia and anti-Asian racism in particular, even if folks themselves are not experiencing that, let's say they're not the ones who's been spat on in the streets or encountering verbal abuse, seeing these stories in the news can still have a lasting emotional impact and toll on people who look like me. And I think it's also important for us to distinguish the very specific types of racism that we're seeing against East Asians or people who look like Chinese, right? And this is a global phenomenon where, you know, even in my home country in South Korea and Japan, there's been instances of anti-Chinese racism in Asian countries, right? Where, you know, Chinese people or people who look Chinese, you know, a lot of people joke that you can't tell us apart. But if you're, you know, using a particular accent, or if you are dressed in a certain way that signals your ethnicity, that could still, you know, become a targeting factor. And, you know, I've been talking to a lot of different organizations, and I'm really in awe of leaders at this moment working to create space for these conversations to happen. So I just got to give a shout out to Erin, who's on the webinar right now, who leads diversity and belonging at Upwork. Who created space very early on to be able to talk about this issue and worked with the Asian ERG leaders to be able to create space for that. And what we're hearing is, even if folks are not experiencing anti-racist acts themselves, their moms, their parents, their loved ones, their siblings, or, you know, community members, seeing them be attacked in the media has an impact on people. So I think it's really important for us to not forget about that. And also just the fact that, you know, the FBI has issued a warning about the increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans in this country. And folks are reporting there are about 100 hate crimes being reported each day against the Asian Americans, which is really alarming. And also knowing that most hate crimes against any communities are very, very underreported, right? Because it takes a particular criteria for you to be able to categorize certain acts of hate crimes. So just taking note of that and knowing that any type of reporting out there is probably very underreported, which is also saddening. And there have been, you know, very vicious attacks that have been covered by the media. I don't know if folks have been paying attention to that, but there's been an acid attack in Brooklyn. There's been a stabbing against 2-year-old, 6-year-old, 3 Asian families in Sam's Club. And, you know, these are motivated by people's fear and people's hatred towards, you know, scapegoating a group of people and needing to find some explanation for why all of this is happening, which is, to your point, has been an historical pattern we've seen, not just against Asian Americans, but all marginalized communities.
Yeah, and so on top of all of that, also there is anti-Asian harassment and discrimination and biases that are coming out in you know, now that we're for the majority of companies are a remote culture now. Some of them have been thrust into this very, very quickly without a lot of the things in place that you would have in person around anti-harassment, anti-bullying, and so on top of this, there's also a danger of having this permeate throughout the internet, throughout the Slack messages, and little pieces here and there throughout the remote culture as well, that I think is really important in the culture to address quickly, to have that code of conduct, have those procedures to really address those things as they come up in the workplace. And having safe conversations, of course, and like you talked about earlier, is incredibly important and powerful, and also a way to really open up allies to be able to say something, to make that space so that allies can say something when they see something and do something when they see something. So let's talk a little bit more about what companies can do, what allies can do to really help make a difference, and to step in or step back, as the case may be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think, I always like to start with allying inward. That's the phrase that Erin uses with Upwork. And at Awaken, we acknowledge that allyship can happen at various levels, right? So allyship can happen in a personal sphere, interpersonal sphere, organizational sphere, which can then lead to institutional systemic change. And I really want to urge folks to really think about, what can I do now personally? And that can start with a lot of awareness and also questioning and interrogating our own beliefs. And that goes for even Asian people in general too. I think there's a lot of narratives and biases that are fueling the anti-Asian racism and xenophobia today, that's related to just subtle messages that we've been receiving about Asian people in general, right? So, from the 1800s, the messages of yellow peril, where, folks really categorically saw Asian people as a global threat because of the economic competition or diseases that they were bringing to different countries. And what have you. So I think it's important for us to kind of question, when we're talking about COVID-19, for example, and people are still talking about and making jokes about Chinese people eating bats, and that being the cause of this entire pandemic. Or, talking about Asian people being dirty or not going to Chinese restaurants, even before the shelter in place took place. I think these are moments where we can start to question, what are some of my deeply held beliefs that I haven't examined closely, to unlearn some of these stereotypes and biases that we have. I think another really important conversation that I want to lift up, because people are not, I haven't heard a lot of conversations happening around this, is, some folks are responding to this resurgence of racism conversations by saying, well, now that racism is impacting Asian people, now they're talking about racism. So welcome to the club. Finally, you are with us in this fight, but a little too late type of conversation, or disappointment around, the lack of social and political engagement on the part of Asian Americans. And I think that also is something that we need to lean into and challenge, because this whole notion of Asians being apolitical, or Asians not caring about, anti-Black racism, I think those conversations really need to happen in order for us to actually build coalition across different marginalized communities. And, on the one hand, I think there is a lot of erasure that Asian Americans experience across different ethnicities, because we are so often counted as a monolithical group. One thing that as organizations can do is to really disaggregate the data and start being very specific about who is represented in the Asian American communities, because even in the national data that we gather, we often erase the experiences of so many different Asian communities that are suffering, that's leading to lack of resource allocation. This whole idea of Asians as a monolith or as a model minority who doesn't really care about the social justice causes can also perpetuate some of these biases, and it may slow down the progress that we can make across different POC, people of color groups, and also the complexity around having to hold and talk about anti-Blackness in the Asian American community, I think is so important, so that we can collectively do the work of being allies to one another at the same time, which is not an easy task, and it's complicated and it's messy, but I think all of these things actually need to be brought up to the surface for us to be able to have fruitful conversations about what does allyship really look like in this moment for us. And in order for us to actually have these conversations, what work and what healing do we need to do in each of our communities so that we can really build coalition?
Yeah, absolutely. And I fundamentally believe that we all have to work together, that we're all in this together, and we all need to be allies for each other. And it really, we won't fundamentally change things until we all do, until we stop tearing each other down and really help build each other up, and really work work together to create that change. I agree with you wholeheartedly. That's a really important point.
Yeah. And I think, you know, it's important for us to also talk about, when we talk about being allies to the Asian American communities or Asian communities, let's actually unpack that. What does that look like? Because it's not just about someone calling out, someone saying Chinese virus. That's one thing that we can do. Or, you know, I think there's a very specific picture that people have about what does that look like, being an ally to Asian American communities. And we often forget that there are Asian LGBTQ people, there are Asian undocumented people, there are Asian incarcerated people. So all these issues that we're working on together in different communities, there are Asian people impacted by all of these important issues. So it's not necessarily this one-dimensional support that I'm seeking from other folks when it comes to supporting my community. It's actually being nuanced and bringing in that rich sort of, you know, activism work that's already being done by Asian people and supporting that work as well. And in particular today, in this circumstance, I think a lot of people who are poor are suffering, people who are service line workers are suffering, people who are disabled are suffering, and there are Asian people under all of those umbrellas, right? So we really need to, when we're talking about allyship towards Asian American people, it's not just about, you know, not calling the virus Chinese virus or not saying that you eat bats or making jokes about that. It's actually about lifting up all of these issues that we all have a hand in and knowing that Asians actually are part of all of those discussions as well.
Yeah. So, so people awareness is a part of allyship, and then the action is really the next step and the key to creating change. So what are some things that, some practical things that people can do in the workplace to really help create change?
You know, the one thing that everybody can do that's very easy, but I don't see people doing often enough, is actually just checking in with people. And a core tenet of allyship is us not assuming that we know all the answers, right? And that same tenet can apply in the workplace by asking people, what is it that you need? What does support look like for you in this moment, right? And not just assuming that one size fits all solution will apply to all Asian people categorically, because some Asian people may not want to talk about it. Some Asian people may want to talk about it and they're mad that you haven't brought it up. And you won't know until you ask. And so creating that space for you to be able to check in, I think, is really important. And, you know, it's important also that we are, you know, normalizing this type of behavior. Because I think, you know, to your point earlier around ensuring that we're creating the space where allies can say something, I often think about the statistics around how women and people of color, when they bring up issues around bias, they're often punished or penalized for doing that. And it's important for us to create an environment where there are minimal repercussions, if any, for people bringing up concerns. So if you're not the one who's bringing up concerns, the thing that you can do is make sure that the person who's bringing up these issues are not penalized or seen as a troublemaker or, you know, causing unnecessary risk in the workplace. I think that's also an act of allyship that is often missed, where you can actually let people say the things that they want to say, ask for things that they need without facing repercussions. And that's the job of, you know, all allies, being able to create that space.
Great. I just want to, I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions for us, we'll address that. We'll address questions following our discussion. So put your questions in the Q&A, which is down at the bottom of your screen there, in the little Q&A. Put your questions there, and we're seeing them pop up, and we'll answer them in a few minutes. Okay. So, let's talk about you. What do you need as an ally? What are some things that allies have really helped? How have allies really helped you along your path? And what do you need from an ally?
I really appreciate that question, because often I'm not really thinking about what I need. So what I need, thank you for asking, what I need, I think right now is folks engaging in these conversations and creating space for us to challenge each other. And I would love for us to not have a simplified, reductive conversation around what being an ally to Asian American looks like in this moment. And I think it's really important for us to bring that lens of intersectionality and also solidarity into this conversation. And I see this not as a moment that we should be angry about all the racism we're seeing against Asian people, but recognizing that this is actually a pattern that so many of us are familiar with, right? Whenever there's been a crisis in this country or globally, some marginalized groups of people will be the scapegoats, whether it be the 9/11 and Muslim community, or the AIDS epidemic and the LGBTQ and Black community. And that right now, the scapegoat happens to be, and the target happens to be on the Asian Americans. And I would love for us to actually recognize this as yet another example and use this as a moment for us to engage in cross-community dialogue, which is exactly what we're doing right now, and how we are amplifying some of these conversations inside workplaces as well as outside workplaces. So that sort of creation of and willingness to create the space to have these conversations for me means a lot. And inviting Asian people who've been involved in activism work to actually, bring their perspectives forward. And remembering also that there's such rich histories of Asian American activism in this country that's often forgotten and erased. And that's by design, right? That is the particular flavor of racism that Asians experience is erasure, and sort of grouping into a monolithic imagery. And, I was just recently on a panel with an incredible journalist, writer, and activist, Helen Zia, who talks about Asians being either gangster, gook, geisha, or geek. And for us to be able to challenge these narratives about Asian people in this country, I think that will go such a long way. If everybody on this call can actually take a moment to reflect on what are my own held beliefs that I have about Asian Americans or Asian people in general. And one question that we sometimes ask to our participants of our Combating Xenophobia workshop is, can you name 5 Asian leaders who have made a difference in the US? And the vast majority of people cannot name 5. I had a hard time naming 5 without really taking a moment to think. And I think that kind of, aha moment around how much I don't know, how much I've not been given access to know, is such a powerful reckoning, right? For all of us to do the work of understanding how we got to where we are today, and what can I do? What do I need to learn to be able to be a little bit better than I am today in being able to articulate the contribution and the presence of Asians in this country and what work they're involved in today in so many different ways.
That sent shivers down my spine, and I think for a lot of people, I'm seeing reactions that it really hit home for them too. Yeah. So I'm going to flip it now. You are also an ally for a lot of other groups, a lot of other people with other identities. And can you talk a little bit about why you're an ally and what you do as an ally?
Yeah. I also want to just name that I don't actually call myself an ally because, the term allyship for me is a verb, right? And it's something that other people have to give to me. So thank you. And I appreciate the reminder that we, send out to folks about allyship being something that is time bound. When you do something that somebody calls it, that was really helpful for me and that was an act of allyship, that's great. But then that expires the moment that moment is over, right? And so I don't get to keep that as my resume, if you will. I think what I commit to doing and what I try to do is whenever we're talking about any type of racism work towards Asian people, we also need to open that up to talking about other marginalized communities. Right now, this moment, there's a lot of, and I'm so glad that there's so much attention being put on xenophobia and anti-Asian racism that folks are experiencing. And there are disproportionate impact that's being put on Black and brown communities, disabled communities, undocumented communities, people who are facing domestic abuse. And whenever there's attention being put on my platform, I think it's my job to be able to share that platform by amplifying the stories and perspectives of other people and the resources that you can actually check out. That's not just me, because I can only tell the stories from my perspective, but there are so many folks doing such great work that I would hope that if you're following me on social media, that I'm doing the best that I can to amplify those struggles and stories of other people, and giving the agency and ownership to folks in those communities to be able to tell their stories. And I'm also not mistake-free. I make mistakes, and I would love folks to, and I always appreciate my team, who is my biggest inspiration, motivation, and accountability partners in this work. Always checking me on who am I forgetting? Who might I be missing in this conversation? And whose voices do I need to really amplify and include in this moment? So that's my commitment to all of you who's witnessing this conversation, as well as the commitment that I always make to myself in being able to do this work, because I can't do this work alone. And truly building solidarity and coalition is, I believe, the only way that we can achieve equity at any level. Because the systems that we live within impacts all of us. And until all of us are free, none of us is free. So that's a quote that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I truly, deeply believe in that.
Awesome, awesome. And you, Awaken, offers some training specifically around xenophobia. How do people learn more about that? Where do they go to learn more about that?
You can go to our website. Thank you for giving that shout out. So you can check out all of our workshop offerings on our website, www.visionawaken.com. And it'll have the virtual workshop options, which includes the xenophobia, combating xenophobia during COVID-19.
Great, great. I'm going to go to some questions now. Some of these are really deep. These are awesome. What would you say to organizational leaders who are afraid to address issues of race and racial discrimination within the broader society in the workplace? This is from Olivia White Lopez. I know some managers who are concerned that it isn't our place to speak about these topics. For example, anti-Asian harassment, violence in light of COVID.
I think that's such a great question. I appreciate Olivia for asking that question so much, because I think this is not just about this particular issue, but a lot of managers that we work with, or a lot of organizational leaders, especially at the executive level too, have a hard time figuring out when is the right time for me to address certain issues that are happening in our society today. And I think for me, the baseline is, if something is impacting your team, if it's something that's relevant to your team and could have an impact on your team, that is a workplace issue, right? So when we try to separate, this is not my place, or this is not a workplace issue, this is not related to our work, I would challenge that, because everything that we are experiencing outside or inside the workplace has an impact on the work that we produce. So I think that's a reason, but also when you're addressing these issues, it can be coming from a place where you are impacted. So even if you're not Asian, if seeing anti-Asian racism in the media is bothering you, which I hope it does, then you can actually come from your own perspective of owning that experience and saying, hey, I am really bothered and disturbed by what's happening in this country right now. So I just wanted to take a moment to let you know that I am impacted by this and wanted to check in to see how you're doing. That's a better approach, in my opinion, than saying, you're Asian, you must be really impacted by what's going on in this country. So I just wanted to create space to talk about that. That's an okay approach, but there's a lot of assumptions again, and you are I think there's more successes that we've seen if you're able to make this about you and being authentic and vulnerable about how you're experiencing this experience right now, right? So you can even say, I don't even have all the right words to be able to describe this right now, but I know that I am being impacted and I am bothered by what's happening. And you can just leave it at that too. And some people may engage in a conversation if they want to. Some folks may think, that's interesting, but I'm going to go about my day. That's okay, because you've already established yourself as someone that somebody can come to you to discuss these issues with. And that's about signaling that you are here to hold space for folks who want to continue that dialogue. And I believe that that's a brave and courageous act that all organizational leaders can take up.
Awesome. Here's another one from Corey Ponder. Hey, Corey. Would really love to address empathy specifically. Do you believe that there is self-work or actions we need to take before we can truly empathize and show up as effective allies? Or do you feel like people can show up and learn through empathy? So how does empathy play a role in allyship, and yeah.
I think empathy plays a really important role, and I wish we could do this work without empathy too. So that's my wishful thinking sometimes, where, sometimes I wish that we didn't have to get people to, care about it from their own experience, if you will. Like, I wish that people could just kind of see that there's injustice and rise to the occasion. However, that's not been the effective path that I've witnessed in the work that I do. And I have seen that in order for folks to really commit to the act of allyship and consistent action over time, there needs to be a deeper why that's not just about the business case for diversity in the workplace, right? And I think that can come from empathy, and the empathy of being able to understand or at least have an idea for the pain that folks might be going through. And that has been effective when we are having conversations around how all of our social identities impact the way that we experience the world differently. I think it's a fine balance, because I don't want empathy to be the only thing that we count on, because there's going to be people who just don't give a shit. And how do we get people to act regardless of their levels of empathy to do the right thing, right? And I think it's a tough balance, because I see the effectiveness when people do care genuinely what they can do and show up to, doing this work. And I wish that we didn't always have to count on somebody developing genuine empathy to do the right thing.
Sophie asks 3 big questions. I'm just going to address one of the 3. How do we encourage allyship? How do we encourage allyship? How do we encourage others to become allies and to be better allies?
Yeah. So in our work, we've seen a lot of success when they know how their own team members or their communities are impacted by disparities or racism or systemic injustice in the workplace. I think that's one way. And truthfully, I think the journey to allyship is different for everyone. And I sometimes feel conflicted about having people be exposed to the pains and traumas of marginalized people to activate them to be allies. I like to believe that we don't need that to activate people to do good in the world. However, I do think that for some people that may be a really sort of compelling way for them to get activated. So I don't want to shit on any approach. I think we've used all those different approaches, and I just want to be cognizant about naming the tension there in using other people's pain and trauma to educate folks who may not be privy to that. And I think that's a very delicate act that needs to be based on agency and consensual sharing, and sort of not educating people at the expense of the most marginalized in the room is a core principle of ours at Awaken. And so how do we really balance that And I think in order for people to really create behavior change, they need to go through their own journeys of developing the awareness first, but also building that desire, gaining the knowledge and tools that they need to do that, being able to practice, being able to be willing to be uncomfortable and be challenged in moments when they feel challenged or they've made a mistake. I think these are all different skills that we can teach, and it takes practice for people to be comfortable showing up in very sort of visible ways. And there's a lot of things that you can do without having to be visible to other people, that you can do a lot of the work on your own and in your own community that may not be about, you know, sort of putting the ally badge on and saying, I'm an ally and I do all these things. And a lot of the active allyship that I've experienced in my life has been from people who are sort of silently doing that and amplifying other people's work.
Awesome. Andrea Chasko asks, and I think it sounds like she's grappling with this as well, as a tough question around, so the Asian community has been quite torn on how to address xenophobia right now. What are your thoughts about Andrew Yang's comments about Asians having to show their Americanness now? And she quotes him, I won't read the whole quote, but we Asian Americans need to embrace and show our Americanness in ways we never have before, to step up, help our neighbors, donate gear, vote, wear red, white, and blue, etc. What is in our power to do today as Asians without having to prove our patriotism?
I knew this question was going to come up. This article, I mean, I'm getting hot here. Andrew Yang wrote an article, for those of you who need to catch up, about how Asian Americans can combat xenophobia against them right now. And in a nutshell, what he said was, we just need to prove that we are American, that we've been American all along, that we just need to wear red, white, and blue, drink beer, you know, all the things. And it really plays into, and he's doubling down on the fact that we are the model minority and that we deserve to not be treated as such. And I think that is a really, really dangerous and violent narrative that we need to dispel right away. And I think the model minority, and I've been using this phrase without kind of defining what it is, but you know, the whole idea of model minority emerged in the 60s when there needed to be a divide and there needed to be a tool for us to be able to put down Black and brown activists who were causing a lot of quote unquote noise during the civil rights movement. They were protesting. There were folks who were actively engaged in civil disobedience. And we needed to create a different narrative for Asian Americans, specifically Japanese Americans, to be seen as docile, submissive, and apolitical. So these are the good kind of immigrants. These are the bad kind of immigrants. And by being called a model minority, we are also losing histories, right? Centuries of histories of us being activists, being right alongside the Black Panthers marching in the civil rights movement. All of the history gets erased, right? And we are seen as just doctors, lawyers, and you know, tech workers who don't really care about diversity and inclusion. These are all false narratives that we need to challenge. And the only way, and by the way, being the model minority has not gotten us to the point we need to be today, right? If we were successful at delivering against the model minority myth, and we were sort of the model immigrants who didn't cause any trouble, and that was somehow going to earn us the status that white people have, well, we're not there yet, right? And I don't think the answer is doubling down on that approach yet again. And I think now is the time for us to dismantle this narrative and to be able to build solidarity across different communities and to really counter and challenge where that trope came from and how that has had a negative impact on our community. Because some folks might say, well, isn't being a model minority a good thing? Isn't Asians being seen as good at math? Why is that so bad? Well, it's bad because it erases so many histories and identities and experiences of so many people under the Asian American umbrella. And it leads to lack of funding. It leads to lack of data points that we can use. It leads to, you know, communities being pitted against each other. And for all the reasons, I think that article by Andrew Yang was complete crap, and we should not promote it. I think that there are different ways by building solidarity across other communities, you know, speaking up against the model minority myth, and also claiming some of the contributions that we've made in the social justice movement throughout this history and country, and amplifying the work of so many amazing Asian organizations today. I think those are all very tangible actions that we all can take to, you know, be countering that type of argument.
Well said. Well said. This one comes from Lindsay. Recognizing that many well-meaning organizations that want to have these candid discussions may not be equipped to do so, what have you said or done, or what resources do you recommend in the moment when you witness candid discussions around race or xenophobia escalating into an unproductive place?
Yeah, I also really appreciate the preface of that question, where for well-meaning organizations that are not yet equipped. So I think if an organization is well-meaning, meaning I'm expected to see on their careers page a stock photo of people of all backgrounds. I am expected to see one of their values touting diversity and inclusion. If there are public-facing promises or signaling that there is some level of care going into topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think now is the chance, now is the time for folks to be able to show that to commitment in real ways, whether that is investing in resources so that folks can actually have the tools to be able to speak to these types of biases or racism in the workplace, or being able to create space to amplify stories of folks who are experiencing these types of issues, or being able to really, you know, hold people accountable for saying things that are harmful and causing harm in different ways. I think these are all very doable things that well-intentioned people or well-intentioned companies should be able to do right now. And, you know, I think this conversation around, you know, what can we do around DEI during this time when budgets are getting cut, when, you know, we're laying people off, DEI feels like a nice to have, is yet another signal that we're seeing in the industry that DEI has never been a core part of the business, that it's always been seen as an extracurricular activity that you do when you have the money, when you have the resources, when you have the time, when you have the wherewithal to be able to kind of put the cherry on top. Whereas, you know, DEI really should be an approach that we have to all things, right? All decisions that are being made, whether it be who are we laying off? Have we done an analysis about who is disproportionately impacted by that? Because studies are now coming out showing that Black and brown folks, and specifically women, are disproportionately getting laid off or being unemployed. So when we look at these types of decisions being made without any regard to DEI, that's information that we're seeing around whether this company or an organization or a leader was truly committed to DEI and how we're actually practicing DEI as an approach rather than an extracurricular one-day training. I think this is when things are starting to show up. And I've been telling people, tech has been obsessed with diversifying the hiring pipeline. How do we recruit more underrepresented candidates? Now is your time to be able to do that. There are lots of folks looking for jobs. So if you are hiring, that's one very concrete way that you can actually create equitable processes so that you can create a more diverse pipeline and to be able to build a more diverse and inclusive team.
Awesome. We are running out of time, so we aren't going to get to all of the questions. Maquiba, you have a great question here. I don't think we're going to get to that. Torin, Shane, Melinda, Antoinette, Abdul Razak, and another one from Melinda. But I do want to ask one final question here. This is a great one to end with, I think, from Grace Rodriguez. Our entrepreneurial ecosystem has an opportunity to create new solutions. I'm sorry, that actually wasn't the one. That another one just popped up in that place. But maybe, yeah, I'm actually going to skip that one. Sorry, Grace, and go to Aditi's question here, which I think is a good one to end on. How do you, in your work, help people build the resilience needed to practice allyship? And a part of that, I think, is also building the resilience in all of us who are doing this work daily, because it is an emotional, it's emotional work. It's important to take care of ourselves in all of this. How do you help folks build capacity to accept that they will fail, that in their efforts they may fall short or cause unintended harm? And then how do we resolve that and any shame or guilt that comes up in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate that. I think building resilience is so important in this work, and being able to name the fragility that we all experience, I think, is also really important. And to normalize that when we are challenged by someone on our, behavior, it's important for us to actually be able to name and normalize the fact that these feelings are going to come up for us, whether that is defensiveness or shame or guilt, or feeling ignorant. There are so many different types of emotions that get in the way of us actually being able to show up for people that we say we want to show up for. So one, being able to practice naming those feelings and noticing those feelings when they come up, I think is hugely important and has been helpful in our trainings. And number two, the skills to be able to gracefully accept responsibility and to be able to hold ourselves accountable. What does that actually look like? What are the words that we can use when we make mistakes, when we mess up, which we all will, and I do? How do we actually apologize? What are the words that we can say? What are some things that we should not do that we have all the inclination to do, like explaining that we're not that people, or explaining that that's not what I meant? These are all sort of, things that get in the way of us being able to build resilient connections across the board. And the last thing here also is, for me, as someone who's working in DEI, going into companies to be able to challenge people in a compassionate but critical way, because I think those two things can go hand in hand. You can be compassionate and critical and honest at the same time. I think there's a lot of DEI professionals or leaders that are not actually being given the leeway to push the boundaries. And so I think we need to do a better job of showing up with honesty and being able to name the things that we haven't been naming the way that we should have been, or using euphemisms and sort of coddling the status quo. I think that behavior needs to end. I think that we need to do a better job of being able to come in as third parties, being able to say the things that perhaps people inside the organizations are not able to say because of the negative repercussions that they face, and being able to create the right container for us to be able to hold that truth in a compassionate as well as critical way is such an important responsibility. So I want all folks doing DEI work to, start creating resilience for ourselves so that we can speak the truth, we can name those things, and we can actually hold that fragility for ourselves and others in a way that feels authentic and not losing sight of the bigger goal that we all have.
Awesome, awesome. Well, we are out of time. I thank you again, Michelle. Thank you so much for this. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you for your great questions and for being a part of this. Join us next week where we'll talk about the next episode of Leading with Empathy and Allyship. You can stay in the loop by signing up for our newsletter at changecatalyst.co, changecatalyst.co. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you, everyone.